By now, I feel like everyone knows who Conor McGregor is. Even if you don't watch MMA, you would probably know him as the guy who fought Floyd Mayweather in one of the biggest boxing spectacles of our time. But if you did follow Conor's rise in the UFC, you saw that he made one of the biggest impacts in the company's history. Conor McGregor changed the UFC, but was it for the better? Hey guys, it's Keon, and today I want to talk about the most notorious man ever to step in the UFC octagon. Conor McGregor. Specifically, I want to talk about the things McGregor did that changed the UFC. And I'll speak about the positive and negative effects it had on the company. Aside from Conor being popular because of his elite striking, I think most of his fans like him for his trash talking. Before Conor, Chael Sonnen was definitely the biggest trash talker in MMA. But Conor revolutionized trash talking because he backed it up by dominating his opponents. And aside from that, he was very quick-witted. For example, when Chad Mendes asked Conor if he knew what wrestling was, Conor responded with, "I could rest my balls on your forehead." Like, who comes up with that so quickly and uses it to such an effect? Only Conor McGregor. Obviously, this brought a new entertainment aspect to the fight game. Don't get me wrong, there has always been trash talking in MMA, but Conor used it to build his resume and in return, make more money. He became the guy who said the funniest things whenever he would do interviews or press conferences. So of course, many people wanted to tune in and see what he had to say next. I have to admit myself, whenever a Conor McGregor press conference was going down, I had to watch it. Now, the good thing about Conor's trash talking was that it was really entertaining. People loved it, but the problem with it was it really helped Conor propel through the rankings ahead of other fighters who were ranked higher than him. This definitely frustrated other fighters who earned their ranking in the division and wanted to fight for the belt. But Conor steamrolled through all of that because he became more than a good fighter. He was entertainment, and of course, the UFC saw this and pushed Conor McGregor as much as they could. Conor even said that the Fertittas let him stay in the Copacabana suite instead of the regular fighter's hotel. Yeah, the UFC was pushing this guy a lot. This changed the UFC game a lot because now being a good fighter wasn't enough to make the big money. Being a character became a huge aspect of the fight game because of Conor, and now we have so many other fighters doing the same because they too want that push from the UFC. Conor's meteoric rise brought so much attention to the company, and in July of 2016, the Fertittas sold their share of the company to WME-IMG for approximately $4 billion. This is very big money, and because of it, many fighters were angry as they thought they weren't receiving their fair share of money. Conor even said he deserves shares to the company because if it wasn't for him, the UFC wouldn't have been sold for $4 billion, which is true, and in my opinion, is the reason the Fertittas decided to sell the company at such a high point. Selling the company for this price really made fighters think about their worth in the company because, think about it, the average fighter makes around $10,000 to $100,000 a fight. Imagine if we go on the low end of that pay. Making $10,000 for a fight that you train months for really doesn't seem worth it since the money has to pay for your bills and your training camp. Plus, these fighters aren't doing any normal job. They're taking blows that could potentially damage their bodies forever. And it's not like the UFC has a retirement plan for these fighters. Plus, the entire Reebok deal took away sponsorships from fighters, and for most of them, they relied on those sponsorships to make most of their money. Because of this, fighters began unions or simply left the company to go to other fight promotions. They believed they weren't receiving enough, especially from a company that was valued at $4 billion. But before Conor, fighters were never talking about this. It wasn't until Conor started valuing himself in relation to the company's value that other fighters themselves did the same. Now, after Conor's win against Jose Aldo at UFC 194, he targeted lightweight champion Rafael dos Anjos for his next fight because he wanted to become the first fighter in UFC history to hold 2 belts simultaneously. But aside from making history, Conor no longer wanted small fights. He wanted the big money, and big money was in super fights. In my opinion, this started the super fight era in the UFC. I know GSP vs BJ Penn was a super fight, but I don't think that fight was made because of the money. It was made simply because BJ Penn wanted to hold 2 belts, but after that fight, no one really cared for super fights. Because of this, Conor would fight the biggest super fight of them all against Floyd Mayweather. And of course, this gave him the greatest payday of his life. More UFC fighters started to see that super fights were the way to make the big bank, and since then, we've had so many discussions of super fights, not just between fighters, but also from the fans. Super fights have become such a huge thing that now Demetrius Johnson is receiving backlash for not accepting a super fight with TJ Dillashaw. This is the man who has the record for the most title defenses in UFC history, yet he's still receiving for not accepting a super fight. After Conor won his super fight against Eddie Alvarez in UFC 205, he became the first double champion. The issue with this is that it becomes much more difficult to defend 2 belts at the same time. So what did Conor do? He didn't defend any of his belts. Instead, he took the super fight against Floyd Mayweather because after you win a super fight, you go for more super fights because there's no way in hell you'll go back to fighting regular fights for the regular pay. Because of this, both the featherweight and lightweight divisions had no title fights. What it did do was build up many challengers in both divisions, which I think is good in a sense. But at the same time, divisions were being held up because the champion was inactive. This became an even bigger problem when the UFC allowed Conor to keep his belts while inactive. Eventually, they stripped him from his belts, but he kept both of them for a very long time without defending either. This also created the Interim Championship frenzy, and at one point in the lightweight division, there was no clear answer for Dana White in regards to who the real lightweight champion was. But after this, the UFC used the Interim Championship label to sell fights and pay-per-views whenever the actual champion was inactive. An Interim Championship was created for Robert Whittaker and Yoel Romero when Michael Bisping took the GSP super fight. Talks of a light heavyweight Interim Championship is in fruition because of Daniel Cormier potentially taking the Brock Lesnar super fight, which again will put two divisions on a standstill. Conor McGregor hasn't fought in the UFC since 2016, and with Ronda Rousey retired as well, the UFC lost two of their biggest stars. As a result, the UFC has been desperately trying to create new stars. When I say desperately, I mean they are pushing up-and-coming fighters way too fast. We've seen it when Yair Rodriguez fought Frankie Edgar after fighting BJ Penn. We've seen it when Francis Ngannou fought Stipe Miocic 1 month after beating Alistair Overeem. We've seen it over and over again. The UFC is rushing the up-and-comers because they desperately want that McGregor money again. WME IMG purchased the UFC during the Conor McGregor era, thinking the company is going to keep making good money as long as he's there. But they didn't anticipate how big Conor would get. In fact, I think at this point, Conor is even bigger than the UFC. My evidence for this is that even after the Bellator incident where he jumped in the cage and almost fought referee Mark Goddard, and even after the bus attack incident in the Barclays Center parking lot that injured two fighters, the UFC is still trying to make the Conor and Khabib fight happen. It's obvious the company is trying to protect Conor McGregor, aka their cash cow, at all costs. My name is Keon, and this was my take on if Conor McGregor ruined the UFC. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have something else that you want to add to this video? Please put it in the comments below because I would love to read it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up because it will help me so much. Please hit the subscribe button right over here and also hit that bell notification so whenever I do drop a video, you'll be the first to know about it. That's all I have for this video. I'll see you guys in my next one.